Somewhere in your home, right now, there is a tiny sliver of metal with a hole punched through one end. But the hands that shaped it may not have been human at all. You've threaded it. You've probably cursed at it. You've almost certainly stabbed your thumb with it at least once. It is one of the most forgettable objects you own. You keep it in a drawer, and you never once think about it. It is also one of the oldest ideas your species ever had, because a version of that exact tool, a thin shaft tapered to a point with a narrow hole drilled clean through the blunt end, was carved from a bird's bone and left on the floor of a cave in southern Siberia around 50,000 years ago. The hole is barely a millimeter across. The point is still sharp. In principle, you could thread it and sew with it this afternoon. Not our kind of human, anyway. We have to slow down here, because we've been trained to think about this the wrong way. When you hear the word sewing, you picture a hobby, a grandmother's kit, a button that fell off a shirt, something small and safe and faintly quaint. So strip all of that away, because it is not what a needle is. A needle is a machine for joining things too fine to join with your fingers. And before it existed, the human body was quietly losing a war it didn't know it was in, the war against the cold. Start with a fact that sounds impossible, because the first piece of evidence isn't a tool at all. It's a parasite. In 2011, a team led by David Reed at the University of Florida sequenced the DNA of lice, specifically the body louse, the kind that doesn't live in your hair but in the seams of your clothing. That louse can only exist if clothing exists. It evolved to live in fabric. So the team ran the molecular clock backwards to find when it split from the ordinary head louse. The answer, published in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution, was staggering. At least 83,000 years ago, and possibly as far back as 170,000. Before that study, guesses about the origin of clothing ranged anywhere from 40,000 to over 1,000,000 years, with almost nothing to anchor them. 5 years of work on lice DNA finally gave us the clock. Humans in Africa were covering their skin long before anyone left a needle behind. But this is where the story turns, because wearing a hide is not the same as wearing clothing. Drape a raw animal skin over your shoulders and you've got a cape. A flat, stiff, drafty thing that gapes open at every edge. To make that skin actually hold heat, you have to cut it, shape it, and stitch the pieces into a form that follows the body and traps a layer of still air against the skin. And to stitch, you first have to make holes. So the real story doesn't begin with the needle, it begins with the tool that came before it. Go to Sibudu Cave, a rock shelter tucked into the cliffs of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. In layers dated to around 61,000 years ago, the archaeologist Lynn Wadley of the University of the Witwatersrand, working with Lucinda Backwell and the French bone specialist Francesco De Rico, has recovered slender, polished bone points and awls. Tools ground to a fine tip, some carrying the microscopic wear of piercing hide. Their analysis appeared in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2008. An awl is beautifully simple. You punch a hole, then push a thread of sinew through it by hand, one stab at a time. It's slow, and it's clumsy, but it works. That's not a needle. That's the idea of a needle. The moment a human first decided that two separate pieces of skin ought to become one. Now think about what the eye changes. A plain awl makes a hole, and then leaves you to feed the thread through by hand, separately, over and over. An eyed needle carries the thread with it. It pierces and pulls in a single motion, and the hole it needs is far smaller and neater. Suddenly you can sew fine, tight, controlled seams. You can join thin material. You can fasten tiny things in place. You can build a garment that fits like a second skin, instead of hanging like a tarp. The eye is the upgrade that turns hide wrapping into tailoring. And the oldest one anyone has ever found takes us straight back to that Siberian cave. Denisova Cave, in the Altai Mountains, is one of the strangest addresses in all of archaeology, because 3 different kinds of human occupied it at different times across 250,000 years. In 2016, a Russian team led by Mikhail Shunkov of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk announced a 7-centimeter needle of bird bone, complete with a drilled eye, from a layer roughly 50,000 years old. As of today, Shunkov said, it is the most ancient needle in the world. The eye is about 1 millimeter wide, and the bone around it was deliberately thinned so the thread could fold through cleanly. A refinement more careful than a lot of needles, made tens of thousands of years later. Whoever made this was not fumbling. They knew exactly what they were doing. And the unsettling part is which people those were. The deposits of that age at Denisova are most closely tied not to our species but to the Denisovans, a separate kind of human, cousins of the Neanderthals, known mainly from a fingertip, a few teeth, and traces of their DNA, still carried by people across Asia and the Pacific today. We can't place the needle in one specific hand, but the best current reading is that this exquisite little tool may have been made by people who were not Homo sapiens. Now the picture widens across the whole Ice Age world. At Shaogushan, a cave in Liaoning province in northeastern China, excavators in the early 1980s recovered eyed bone needles dated to somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago. The longest almost 8 centimeters, delicately made, unmistakably the same invention. Across Europe and northern Asia, as the last glacial period clamped down, the needle turns up again and again. This was not one lucky idea in one lucky cave. It was a technology racing through a freezing world because the freezing world demanded it. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. The clothing itself, preserved by pure accident. At Sungir, an open-air site about 200 kilometers east of Moscow, archaeologists uncovered graves roughly 34,000 years old. On the skeletons lay more than 13,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory, and they weren't dumped in a heap. They ran in tight rows across the bodies, tracing the outline of garments that had long since rotted away. From the pattern, researchers reconstructed a fitted outfit, a pullover shirt, trousers joined to footwear, a cap, a cloak, sewn, shaped, and covered in ornament. You do not drape 13,000 beads over a body. You sew them, one at a time, onto clothing cut to fit a specific human being. That is tailoring, 34,000 years ago, lying there in the ground. So what was all of this actually for? The clearest case comes from Ian Gilligan, an archaeologist at the University of Sydney, whose 2018 book, Climate, Clothing, and Agriculture in Prehistory, lays it out in detail. Gilligan argues that complex, fitted, layered clothing was first and foremost a response to cold, survival gear, not decoration. A draped skin might get you through a cool night, but to live through an Ice Age winter, where the wind alone can kill you in an afternoon, you need clothing that seals, sleeves, closed seams, layers that trap warm air and hold it against you while you move. And the tool that makes sealed, fitted clothing possible, the one that lets you build a portable pocket of warmth you can carry into a frozen landscape, is the needle. Think about the map for a second. To leave Africa and hold ground in glacial Europe, on the Siberian Mammoth Steppe near the edge of the Arctic, you are asking a tropical body to survive temperatures it has no natural defense against. The animals around you had fur built for it over millions of years. You had a needle and an afternoon. Now, in fairness, this is exactly where it gets genuinely contested. In 2024, Gilligan himself, with an international team, published a paper in the journal Science Advances that complicates the tidy version. Their argument is that the eyed needle may not mark the invention of tailored clothing at all, because the humble awl could already produce fitted garments perfectly well, tens of thousands of years earlier. So why bother inventing something as fiddly as an eye? Their proposal is that eyed needles signal something different. Fine, decorative work, stitching beads and ornaments onto clothes, and perhaps making the first true underwear as layered outfits grew more elaborate. In that reading, the needle marks the moment clothing stopped being only about warmth and started being about display, about identity, rank, who you are to the people around you. We honestly don't yet know which interpretation wins, but notice that both of them make this little tool enormous. Because here's the reframe that ties the whole thing together. We think of the needle as a comfort. It isn't. It's a passport. Our species evolved in the warmth of Africa, with tropical bodies that shed heat fast and hold it poorly. By every rule of biology, we had no business surviving a Siberian winter, let alone spreading north and east across the coldest, deadliest ground on the planet, and eventually crossing into an entire new hemisphere. We did it anyway. And one quiet reason we could is that we learned to wrap ourselves in engineered warmth we carried on our own backs. That's not a sewing kit. That's the technology that let a tropical ape conquer the frozen world. And you can still watch how well it works, because it never actually stopped. Look at the traditional caribou skin clothing of the Inuit and the Nunavut of the Arctic. Garments tailored to the individual body with darts and gussets and pleats, worn in 2 layers with the fur facing opposite directions to trap a cushion of air, using hollow caribou hair that insulates from the inside out. Openings are kept few and tight, with a hood that can be loosened to dump heat when you're working hard. Elders will tell you, and cold weather researchers agree, that for surviving weeks at 40 below with no way to warm up, this clothing still outperforms a great deal of modern gear. It is the same idea that first flickered to life in that Siberian cave 50,000 years ago, refined to near perfection: cut, shape, layer, seal. So let's retrace the thread. A parasite that can only live in clothes tells us we were covering our skin at least 80,000 years back. Bone awls at Cebudu show us piercing and joining hide 61,000 years ago. A bird bone needle at Denisova, possibly made by another kind of human entirely, hands us the eye at 50,000. Needles at Xiaogushan carry the invention clear across Ice Age Asia, and the beaded graves at Sungir show us the finished product. Genuine fitted, decorated, tailored clothing on real human bodies. Step by step, stitch by stitch, we built the thing that let us walk into the cold and simply stay. Which brings us right back to that forgettable object in your drawer. The needle you own is, in every way that counts, the same tool. A shaft, a point, an eye. It solved its problem so completely that in 50,000 years, the design has barely changed. Every jacket you own, every seam pressed against your body right now, every layer holding the warmth in, all of it descends from a single decision, made in the dark by hands we still can't quite name, that a thread should pass through a hole and bind 2 things together against the cold. The next time you pick one up and squint to thread it, remember what you're holding. It's one of the reasons your species is here at all. All the research is linked in the description.